and welcome back. This is Marla. I'm so glad you're joining me today. Many of you struggle with watercoloring or just simply getting color down on your die cut images or stamped images. Today we're going to do a process that will show you how to create this soft romantic vintage style card. We're going to be using from CottageCutz the Spring Potted Flowers with Bird. I do have the plate. This does come with one plate that will cut out all of the images, and I'm using a piece of Fabriano Artistico cold press watercolor cardstock. Now this cardstock is the highest end cardstock that I have in my stash. One of the features of the cardstock that I like is that it will absorb a lot of water, and I am going to be using a ton of water in this process. I'm using my distress inks. You could use spray stains. You could use other, if you have Catherine Pooler inks, any dye inks that are water reactive are going to work perfectly with this. I want to get a layer of color down, so I started with antique linen. I spritzed my pot and then I spritzed my bird with water. I added water to the antique linen that I pressed onto my glass mat, and then I just basically smushed that pot and the head and tail of the bird into that ink. The next color that I used was tea dye. You'll notice on the bird I'm being very selective. I am not coloring the body, so I'm using my fingers for this process. Instead of laying the entire die cut in this ink, I will use my finger to press areas that I want to collect that ink in. One of the most important things when you are doing this method of smooshing, if you want to layer the colors, you need to dry in between each of the applications. This is frayed burlap that I added to what will be kind of like the top of the bird's head, so there are a few different layers to this. Now I wanted that ink to move just a little bit more, and in order to get that to move, I did spritz it with some more water. So even though I dried it, if I spritz it with water before adding additional color, that ink that has been saturated into the paper and dried, that will continue to move. This is one of the easiest ways to really have control over the colors that you're adding. Typically, if I were laying my whole panel down and creating a background, I would break that color up with my finger, but because I'm being selective with the placement of the ink, I really don't need to do that. This pot is not going to be used. What ends up happening is that it ends up kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It blends in with the bird too much, and so I am going to create a different pot for my final card, but I did want to leave the process in because I will use it on another project later on, but I think that it was still valuable to share how I did the coloring, because this right here is salvage patina, and in just a few moments I am going to add some salvage patina to it to give it that patina feel. Now these are the leaves, and I'm putting most of the salvage patina on the entire leaf. I will add a couple more colors to get a little bit more depth, dimension, and variation, but for the beginning I did want that salvage patina to be the base color for the leaves. You might be wondering why I'm keeping my hand there, and that's because these are such tiny pieces. Typically what I would use is my reverse tweezers and hold each piece up, because the air is going to flow through the paper when it's not laying down on the glass mat. But because I'm drawing so many pieces together, I just wanted to put my hand in place to make sure that they didn't blow all over my desk and I lose them. So here's where I'm adding that patina color. You see that I do have that buildup of the tea dye, the antique linen, a little bit of the frayed burlap. You can also see next to the bird, I'm going to add a little bit more of the tea dye and then a little bit more of the salvage patina. But you'll see when I finish with this that it just you know, it just blends too much with my bird, and so I end up setting it aside, and I'll use it for another project. It's not that I don't like it, it's just that I don't like it for this project, and that's okay. Next, we're going to add that second color to our leaves. Now I have peeled paint for this. And this time I'm trying to be just a little bit more selective with where I'm placing those leaves. So I am using my reverse tweeze. I'm trying to keep that green to one side of the leaf, still allowing that beautiful salvage patina to show through. Using lots of water with this, you'll see that later on when I start coloring the chest of the bird with this peeled paint, that I will spritz it. I will not spritz it with water on one of the applications, and I get more of a molted look. So the look does change. The water does help the ink to flow, and if you want more of a concentrated color, then you would not spritz the bird with that water. Here for the first application, I used the water, spritzing the bird and adding that ink. Now it's dry, and you'll see that it's much more concentrated. See that? And it's just not moving. I'm going to add a little bit more, I believe, of the tea dye to the top of the head, because I did get too much of that peeled paint there. And again, this is that selective smushing. And then I want that peeled paint to move, and you saw that by adding that spritz of water that I was able to get more of a movement, and I was able to get that ink to flow. Moving on to our flowers, I thought I wanted to go with the blue, and so I started with the muted speckled egg, which is a very light blue. And I'm just tapping these flowers into that ink, and then I'm going to add a little bit of the prized ribbon, trying to give it a little bit more of a pop of color. But what I do find is that it still isn't quite it's still not quite as intense. It's not popping off like I really want it to. It's still blending in with the leaves. And so I do end up bringing in, I believe it's Dusty Concord, which is a purple, and you're going to see how it really transforms these flowers. These flowers are just going to be absolutely gorgeous with this three-color combination. Now, because I did use the Dusty Concord, it breaks one of my rules. One of my rules for card making is I like to incorporate the color at least twice in my composition, but I didn't end up doing that. I ended up creating a background, which I forgot to film. And so I'm going to create a second background for you to just show you the process on how I did create the beautiful romantic background. And this is going to be with stamps. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the ink smushing with die cuts. And then I'm going to go on and show you how to create a beautiful background using stamps, the distress inks, and water. So here we're doing that tapping. I'm going to put all of these pieces together off camera. So I will build the bird and I'll build the flowers off camera. This is crushed olive. I'm going to add it to not only the centers of these flowers, but I'm also going to add it. This is the third color that I'm going to add to my leaves. I'm trying to keep it in the same area where I used that peeled paint, so it just gives a little bit more depth of color by melding in the crushed olive and the peeled paint together. It's going to give me a third color on those leaves, which is really going to help bring the composition to life. But going back to the card building, or to this die building, I did build it off camera. For the leaf, or for the wing of the bird, I did use some foam tape there to make sure that I got a little bit of dimension. You know I love my dimension. And here we are going back to that urn that or the pot that I had set aside and didn't like. So I'm coming back with that antique linen, and I did a little bit of ink smushing, but to add some texture to it, I'm stamping this shattered stamp with antique linen, spritzing it with a little bit of water. I'm going to just press that pot into the stamp and look at the texture that I'm able to get. So it's tone on tone. It's still going to be very subtle. This is a stamp set, a much older stamp set from Tim Holtz, and it is, I think, called Glorious Bouquet, and I am going to use it to create a background. So I did show you the background that I created. I forgot to turn on the camera, so I'm just going to recreate it for you. I have another piece of Fabriano Artistico cardstock. This is watercolor cardstock, and I have that antique linen. Again, I want to tone this down. I'm going for more of a romantic feel for this card, still keeping with the vintage style, and so toning down the cardstock with that antique linen is going to give me the color that I'm looking for. I'll dry it in between the applications, as you can see, and then the bouquet has different stems that come in different areas that are on the outer edge of this bouquet. So I'm using that Dusty Concord in this case. I added the ink to one of the areas and then I spritzed it with water. There's lots of ink on that stamp and I am just selectively stamping that. Now there's a berry here and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm spritzing my panel with water, spritzing my stamp with I inked it with peeled paint and then I spritzed it with water, and you can see that I am going to get an abstract background. This is absolutely gorgeous. This is the same way that I created the blue background that I ended up using with my spring potted flowers with a bird, but I just wanted to show this is going to be more of a vibrant. The blue is going to be more toned down. I use salvage patina and the peeled paint for the blue background, and I did attach it to an A2 top folding card base. I showed you a stamp set which was from the Greetery. I'm going to do some heat embossing, but first I want to make sure this panel is dry, so I'm going to run my embossing powder over the top of it. There were still some areas where it was clinging, which tells me that that is wet. So off camera, I went ahead and I dried the panel. So now we're going to take this script stamp and we are going to do some selective stamping. I don't want the entire stamped area. I'm just taking bits and pieces, putting it in my Versamark ink and then stamping it onto my panel. I have this Ranger, I believe it's platinum embossing powder. I'll run it over the top and then we'll use our heat tool to set that, and this is going to give it just a little bit more of that vintage elegance that I wanted for the background. You can see I left the center area pretty blank because I was sure that I would cover that up. So here's what it would look like if I were to use that panel with the potted or spring potted flowers with bird on the purple background. It really does pop, but I'm going to go for that softer, more romantic one. Here's the one that I did previously and forgot to film, and so this again is going to be just a little bit more subtle. Don't worry, I will come back at a later date and I will finish up that panel that's on the right hand side, but I wanted to just share with you the process. I didn't want to leave that out, and so I just went ahead and created one. I thought I would try the purple to see if I liked that. It still was a little bit more purple than the flowers, so I moved back to the softer salvage patina. This is a stitched lace doily from CottageCutz. I will link it in the description box below. I have cut it from the same Fabriano Artistico cold press watercolor cardstock, and I am using that antique linen to add a little bit of that color. I want to make sure that my background is cohesive with this doily. Instead of doing the heat embossing with the script, this time I'm going to still incorporate a little bit of that script, but I'm going to stamp with the salvage patina. Here is where I'm going to add a little bit of that platinum embossing powder. If you didn't know, you can emboss with just water. So I am using a paintbrush and some water, and I just added some little dots around the doily, around the background selectively, and it's going to look a little bit funky to you, and you're going to be like, what in the world did you do to that? But when I put everything together, it just adds that subtle bit of shine that incorporates that embossing powder onto that doily. I thought I was going to do smushing here, which is why I was breaking up that ink. And I started to add it, and I thought, you know what? I think I'd rather use my paintbrush. So here I'm just loosely adding that green watercolor. I wanted that green to kind of ground my pot. So since we are doing an impressionistic card, I did want to just add that little bit of green to give the illusion of grass. So here is everything put together. I'm going to use my press and seal, and you can see some of my leaves did come off. So it's not a perfect process, but it does help. And here I noticed when I had my bird on there that there was an area that you really couldn't see the script, and it was a little bit bare. So I'm just going to add that to that area. We'll use our wet glue to adhere the doily, and then we'll start building our little potted flowers with bird. So you can see that you can do this stamping. You can use this water technique with stamping. It's kind of similar to ink smushing, so all you're doing is just adding the ink to the stamp, spritzing it with water, spritzing your paper with water, and adding the stamping where you want it. You don't have to add the whole image, just parts of it. And then also doing that ink smushing on your die cuts. And this is such an easy process. It really isn't that hard. You do it 1 or 2 times, and then you pretty much can master this. Selectively using your reverse tweezers to put your images in the ink where you want them allows you a little bit more control than if you are coloring directly onto the images, or if you're using spray stains and you're spraying directly onto the images. You just have a little bit more control with this method. Now I added the pot, as you could see, and I added a piece of foam tape behind one of the flowers. One of the flowers has kind of like a V that's an open area, and I wanted the other flower to tuck underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and switch these 2 flowers because I prefer it with that V tucked in underneath, not really showing. And so I just easily picked them up, and I'll just arrange those down. And then I mentioned for the bird, I did add some foam adhesive to the wings, and for the leaf, the large leaf that is behind the bird, I also added a little bit of foam tape to that. So we're going to get this glued down, and then I'm going to start tucking the leaves. Now the back side of the bird underneath his tail feather was a little bit bare, so I'm going to tuck one of the leaves in that area. The curved leaf, I'm going to add it to the left-hand side with a little bit of foam tape, giving it a little bit more dimension. And then I'll tuck the other 2 pieces in, and that will complete my card for today. So I hope that this gave you some encouragement to give this a try. This is such an easy technique, as I mentioned, once you do it once or twice. And you know, if you have water reactive inks, I know the Catherine Pooler inks work beautifully for this. A lot of the dye inks, pigment inks will not work with this. So if you have pigment inks, this smushing really isn't going to work quite as well because the water isn't going to move the ink and allow it to flow. You saw that when I colored the chest of the bird, that I got a little bit more intensity of that green in an area when I went dry on wet, and so I was able to spritz it with water and get that ink to move. So with a pigment ink, you're not going to get that same movement, but most of the dye inks are going to work with this technique. I'm going to show you a close-up of this card, and that will finish things off for me today. I want to thank you so much for joining me. If you like the video, I would love for you to give it a big thumbs up. Please make sure that if you have any questions, that you leave it in the comment section, and I will come back and answer those. Until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks so much for watching.